You're listening to Formosa Files. I'm John Ross.
I'm Eryk Michael Smith, and as we covered in a previous podcast titled Mao Really Wants Taiwan, well, Mao really wants Taiwan, and he was determined to take Taiwan and finish off Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists, but he was held up basically by he didn't have any planes or ships, and then he was defeated on the island of Jinmen. And then this massive spy network that he had on Taiwan was rooted out. But as we started talking about a little bit in that episode, the big blow that really put a dent in the whole plan for invading Taiwan was the Korean War, which involved perhaps as many as 3 million Chinese troops, and a third of 1 million of those men were either killed or lost.
The Taiwan History Podcast, Formosa Files, is made possible through the generous sponsorship of the Frank C. Chen Foundation. Formosa Files.
The Korean War hostilities ended in July 1953. So, John, Mao and the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, they could put their feet up, right? Or not.
Yeah. You'd have thought it was a time for rest and rebuilding.
Yeah.
But the desire to take Taiwan has not dimmed. Mao and his CCP buddies, they turn their sights back to unfinished business. This will lead to what we call the first Taiwan Strait Crisis, or sometimes the first Cross-Strait Crisis.
There were 2 Cross-Strait Crises of the 1950s, and they didn't involve actual invasion plans for the main island of Taiwan itself.
Correct. That's the ultimate goal, but not yet feasible because of American support for Taiwan. So these crises are focused on a series of islands close to the Chinese coast, Jinmen, Mazu, they're kilometers from Fujian coast, and then some islands to the north.
So just for those who may not be aware, Taiwan, or the Republic of China, still governs Jinmen and Mazu and a few other of these small ones. But as we'll talk about in a second, they did lose a few of them. So Jinmen is the main island in today's story. And actually, I'm ashamed to say almost 30 years in Taiwan. I've never been there, but you have, John.
Yeah, it's great.
Okay.
Mazu as well. Yeah.
And when we say just off the coast, it's really just off the coast.
Yeah, we're just talking about a few miles, and it's about 100 miles from Taiwan. Jinmen's not very big. It's, if you put it into a square, because it's not a regular shape, if you put it into a square, it's probably about 12 kilometers by 6.
Okay.
I was thinking about comparisons, something like the Bronx in New York.
Okay. And back then, of course, most people didn't call it Jinmen, which in the Chinese characters are gold and gate, right? Golden Gate. What was the name of the time?
Quemoy.
Right, Quemoy. So these islands clearly are a stepping stone to Taiwan, and Mao really wants to take Taiwan.
Yes, partly it's for Taiwan itself, but much of it is to finish off the nationalists, to finally wrap up the Chinese Civil War. Above all, I think Mao wanted drama. He wanted perpetual revolution. If you needed to describe his reign in a couple of words, those would be perpetual revolution. So, he loved the drama of mass mobilization, the excitement, the possibilities of chaos. Part of the appeal of attacking Taiwan was to fuel the fires of revolutionary socialist fervor in China. The Korean War has finished, so he needs a new source of this mobilization.
Right, it makes sense. And that's not just your personal take on things.
No, this is Mao Zedong's repeated statements in internal CCP documents. Again and again, he talks about using external threats to mobilize the masses. He says the Taiwan issue, the Taiwan task, is most important of all because it raises the political consciousness, the alertness of people, their revolutionary enthusiasm.
Right.
And this will drive the whole country's socialist reconstruction.
Yeah, I mean, it's not exactly the first time we've seen this, right? As long as you have an external enemy, right, it's very helpful. So Taiwan, in this case, is kind of doing double duty, you might say. Yeah. It's a prize on its own merits. It would be nice to take, but it's also a way to vitalize domestic mobilization for building this new China that Mao's got.
Yeah, but it's more than just that. Mao knew American opinion was divided on protecting those islands. and likewise with U.S. allies. So it was a good point to push a divisive issue. So yeah, most allies were against the U.S. protecting the islands and getting tangled up in potential conflict. British Prime Minister of the time, Winston Churchill, for example, he was against keeping the islands. He thought they should be given up.
So Winston Churchill thought the ROC should just sign these islands away. Interesting. What exactly did he say?
Well, we've got letters of him writing to his friend, U.S. President Eisenhower, and he says they're not worth keeping. The U.S. should not become embroiled in their defense. So he wrote to Eisenhower, I do not think it would be right or wise for America to encourage him, that is Chiang Kai-shek, to keep alive the reconquest of the mainland in order to inspirit his faithful followers. He deserves the protection of your shield, but not the use of your sword.
He deserves the protection of your shield, but not the use of your sword. Very interesting. Did Eisenhower think it was reasonable?
Yeah, he writes back in a very friendly tone. He begs partial disagreement, saying he has Chiang's promise not to stir things up along the coast. Eisenhower says he wishes the nationalists weren't on the islands. He would rather the two combatants were separated by hundreds of miles. But that's not the case, and the communists can't be given another victory.
Another victory. By that, you would mean Vietnam.
Yes. Catastrophic defeat. Just a little earlier in the year, the French military in northern Vietnam at Dien Bien Phu, May 54. Big loss, surrender, leads to the division of Vietnam into North, the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, and the South in summer that year.
The more names you have in the title of your country, the more problematic your country generally is.
Yeah.
And this is coming just after there was a division in Korea as well. You've got the Democratic People's Socialist Republic of North Korea, right? So just to clear this up for me, Churchill was suggesting that Chiang Kai-shek give up the entire idea of retaking the mainland as early as the mid-1950s.
He thought it from their departure in 49, it was a lost cause.
Interesting. Okay, so Eisenhower says they can't be given another victory, and he's talking about Vietnam. So, okay, let's imagine you're a quote-unquote reporter working for the Global Times, which is the Communist Party's, the Chinese Communist Party's English newspaper mouthpiece. How would you, if you were a reporter, how would you rationalize Mao wanting to take these islands?
There's a reasonable argument to be made. It's Chinese territory in proximity, right? It's so close. And history. These islands were not given away to the Japanese like Taiwan and the Penghu Islands.
Right.
Secondly, Mao is worried about them being used as an invasion launching pad. I mean, Chiang Kai-shek has the same idea. And also, nationalist commandos are using the islands to raid the coast. They're making shipping difficult along the coast there.
When I was a kid, we had friends who would come and tell us stories about either their dad or somebody, their uncle, who was on one of these islands and would swim over to the other side and do little mischievous things, or, sometimes it was just minor sabotage, like take all the boots from a regiment just to show that we're here kind of thing. So, but it appears that Mao's plans for attack, they differ from the ones he had in 1949 and 1950. This time, there's a lot of domestic propaganda about liberating Taiwan, but the plans on the ground are kind of more modest. Landing troops, even on the islands, isn't the key component. He's hoping that his artillery bombardments can do most of the hard work and just force the nationalists to leave, which is totally logical. If you've got artillery that can hit the islands from your shore, what's the point of landing troops, right? You can just pulverize the islands and then block any ships from supplying them.
Yeah, so the first Taiwan Strait crisis kicks off September 3rd with a heavy artillery bombardment off Jinmen. The small island is packed with over 50,000 nationalist troops, well outnumbering the civilians there. They're well dug in, but of course there are still some fatalities, including 2 American military advisors.
So you just said an area the size roughly of the Bronx, and you've got 50,000 30,000 KMT or nationalist troops there, and a certain number of American military advisors all getting pounded by Chinese shells.
Relatively safe in the granite tunnels, but wouldn't be good for your hearing.
Yeah, so back in the US, they're actually beginning a debate over whether to use atomic weapons.
Yeah.
President Eisenhower is against this. And what they're talking about is using so-called tactical nukes to be used if the Chinese launch an invasion, like baby nuclear weapons.
Well, compared to the latest, strongest nukes, but they're still powerful, just similar to Nagasaki's.
It would have been utterly horrific if it had happened. So in December, the US and the ROC signed the Sino-American Mutual Defense Treaty, which is ratified by Congress and goes into effect in March.
Okay, so the treaty covers the defense of Taiwan and the Penghu Islands, but not those islands along the China coast.
Meanwhile, on the Chinese coast, the action is moving northward. The PLA attacked the Yijiangshan Islands of Zhejiang province in January of 1955, and I read about that in the Taipei Times Taiwan in Time series by Hang Chen. It's an excellent series. You should check that out. And then on the 18th of January 1955, warplanes blasted the Yijiangshan Island, then shelled this uninhabited rock, just 1.24 square kilometers in area for about 3 hours. And then there was a ground invasion.
Yeah, the 700 nationalist troops had signed a blood pledge to fight the enemy to the end. A human sacrifice, Chiang Kai-shek wanting to show the nationalist resolve. It's a heroic last stand to galvanize the people on Taiwan and move American opinion.
Only 700 soldiers, nobody else on that island. They're just there as a last stand, as a show of force. And according to that article I was just mentioning, Taiwan in Time, they say the troops held out for over 61 hours. And in the afternoon of January 20th, Commander Wang Shenming radioed the ROC Army base in nearby Dachang Island. And here's what he said. The enemy is just 50 meters away. In my hand is a grenade I have saved for myself. And then he pulled the pin. The government in Taiwan declared that all 720 Republic of China troops on that island had indeed sacrificed their lives.
Some were certainly captured, but no doubt the great majority died on the island. Yeah, it's a cruel use of soldiers, but it did work. In response, Congress passed the Formosa Resolution, which went further than the Mutual Defense Treaty.
Right. So, as you noted, a cruel use of soldiers, but their goal was to demonstrate that they had the backbone to resist and to get the attention of the U.S. And it worked because this Formosa resolution authorizes Eisenhower to defend not only Taiwan, but now all of these nationalist islands are under the umbrella and he can do as he sees fit.
Correct. The U.S. Navy then assisted the nationalists in evacuating their forces from the nearby Dachan Islands. Those are given up to the communists.
Right. On May 1st, the PLA finally ceases shelling Jimen and Matsu, and that marks the end of the crisis. But the underlying problem is clearly unresolved. And this is a crisis that has lasted 8 months.
Who do you think's gained the most from the crisis? What do you think?
So it's hard to pick it's not hard actually to pick an overall winner. Clearly, the nationalists are the overall winners, but some success for China. They did get some territory, some propaganda value for the people of China, but it's sort of backfired, because the ROC-U.S. Defense Treaty makes liberating Taiwan now a lot harder than it was before.
Yeah, the crisis has shown the importance of nuclear weapons, of the nuclear threat. The PRC feared that the U.S. would use them, and they were handicapped because their nuclear-armed buddies, the Soviets, weren't going to help them out on that score.
Right. So the nuclear threats worked, but they gave Mao an excuse for getting his own arsenal, which he immediately sets about doing.
Yes. In public, the Chinese Communist Party try another softer approach, though. Premier Zhou Enlai spearheads this shift in tactics. We get a couple of years of reduced tensions and relative peace. The CCP want to have negotiations with the KMT, a peaceful liberation. And they publicly announce this intention. Mainlanders, those who have fled China, can come back. They'll be pardoned for their past misdeeds.
Oh, how generous.
Yes. And there are secret discussions, the CCP saying that they would let the KMT rule Taiwan, though as part of the Chinese motherland.
These are fascinating what ifs, but as we all know, nothing comes of it. And before long, Mao is itching for some more of his revolutionary action.
Yeah, on the Chinese home front, things are pretty quiet too. Mao asks for criticism of the party.
This is the famous or infamous 100 Flowers campaign of 1957.
Let 100 flowers bloom, let 100 schools of thought contend.
Yeah, in case you don't know anything about this particular thing, this was Mao telling anybody who had a grievance, write a poem, put something up on the wall, send us a note, let us know how you feel. Honestly, like really let it out. Just tell us, and there'll be no repercussions. We're totally cool with this, but it didn't end well, obviously. It comes to a halt, and in the summer of 57, basically all the people that did bother to send in something were rounded up, and persecution is one word of saying what happened to those folks.
Yeah. So that same year, Mao makes his second and last trip overseas. This was the first one in late 49. This is to Moscow.
Right, but the man of steel has already rested away. Stalin's gone, and it's Khrushchev in charge.
Yeah. So last time Stalin, this time Khrushchev. Mao's in town for a conference of world communists.
How fun.
Communists from all around the world.
And this is when Mao talks about the eastern wind that's prevailing over the western wind.
Yeah.
Communist states being on the ascent, strong enough for an aggressive new approach. And he tells all of the assembled communists it's time for an offensive against capitalism.
Yeah. At the conference, he's scaring attendees by his casual attitude to nuclear weapons. They're looking sideways and wondering if he's joking.
Joking about?
Well, Mao talked in philosophical terms about nuclear war being a small matter for the universe.
Aye, that is not a healthy sign at all.
No. His references to time, too. For him, history, 10,000 years, a basic measure of time. And one of Mao's favorite phrases was paper tiger, and he applied this to nuclear weapons. His comments about his willingness for China to take huge losses, millions, hundreds of millions of its people, left those listening speechless.
Was he joking?
One of the mysteries of that time. But no, people took him seriously. I think some of it was his love of drama, the fun of belligerent rhetoric, but let's say half true.
Yeah, and when you think about these other states that were there, you've got the Soviet Union, East Germany. They're not really interested right at this moment in launching all-out offensive. They're pretty happy with what they've got, and they're probably looking at him going, are you nuts? And also, right, he's there pushing hard for the Soviets to share atomic weapon technology with him. And he doesn't present all that convincing of a case, does he?
No. So, yeah, I mean, for Mao, the Cross-Strait Crises, they're a way for Mao to show the Soviets China needs nuclear weapons.
To be fair, he wants them as a deterrent because there are atomic weapons stationed on Taiwan.
Yep.
In May of 1957, the U.S. announced publicly the deployment of Matador missiles to Taiwan. Matador missiles are those surface-to-surface cruise missiles, and these were armed with atomic warheads.
Yes. Anyway, when Mao gets back from the Moscow Conference of Communists, he's in a hurry to speed up industrialization. He's got a game-changing plan he'll put into action in January 58.
Oh, January 1958. The Great Leap Forward.
Yeah, Mao's attempt to catapult China into the ranks of the great economic powers. What images come to mind when you think of the Great Leap Forward?
Well, there's not a lot of actual footage of the horrific mass starvation. Something like 30 million people died during that time. But there is some really bizarre footage of what they called mass mobilization campaigns. Another term term was backyard steel production or backyard steel furnaces.
Yeah, although backyard doesn't mean people's own backyards. I mean, there was no private land. People are living on huge communes, but yes, the backyards of communes.
So Mao wants to catch up to other powers and be able to claim that he's making as much steel as whatever other country. So you've got amateurs out there trying to make steel. Now, I'm not a metal making expert, but there's two kind of key ingredients, iron ore and coal. And those are not always just laying about.
Where there's revolutionary spirit, there's a way.
Yeah. And in this case, what that meant was people just grabbed any metal object they could find, utensils, tools, pots, bicycle frames, furniture, and then they burned any fuel they could find. And all of this resulted in, as you might imagine, very little usable metal.
Yeah. But, Mao is quite happy with the results because of the mass participation angle.
Yeah. But, John, with the steel, there was at least a logical goal of a kind. Yeah. But, let's talk a little bit about the campaign to kill sparrows, because that's just one of the most bizarre things during that time. It was the Eliminate Sparrows campaign, and you might remember why, right?
Sparrows that were eating grain seed.
Right. So they were eating grain seed that could be used for revolutionaries instead, and these sparrows were not revolutionary enough. So they were hunted into near extinction. Their nests were destroyed. The birds were chased and harassed around the clock, so they died of exhaustion. It was insane.
Yeah.
And of course, sparrows may eat grain and grain seed, but they also eat bugs. And when you get rid of all the sparrows, you have excess amount of bugs.
Yeah, madness, complete madness. There's a strong connection actually between the Great Leap Forward and the Second Taiwan Crisis in 1958. The timing is no coincidence. So an important motivation for the offensive was stoking the fires of revolution, mass mobilization. This is for the domestic audience.
A very hungry domestic audience that is suffering from plagues and not enough food, plagues of insects. So on August 23rd, 1958, the People's Liberation Army begins firing artillery at both Jinmen and some of the nearby Mazu Islands.
That's right. Jinmen feels the brunt of the barrage, nearly 500,000 shells fired at the island in 44 days.
Amazing. So
500,000 shells, 44 days. The only attempted landing was on an island about 25 kilometers away, Dongning Island, but this was repulsed.
It's lucky for the Chinese, actually, that they didn't land on Jinmen. Number one, it would have been a bloodbath. And considering which general had the president's ear at the time, there may have been atomic weapons in the cards for that one if they thought conventional forces weren't sufficient.
Yeah, the Soviets, who hadn't been told about the attack on Jinmen, they sent Foreign Affairs Minister Andrei Gromyko to Beijing for secret talks. Mao tells him if the Americans invade China, Chinese forces would withdraw into the interior. The Soviets should hold off. But once the Americans have been lured into the interior, once they're in the noose, so to speak, the Soviets could use nukes on them then.
He's saying that he's cool with an ally nuking his own country. Wow. This guy.
I shouldn't laugh, but it's just too crazy.
Yeah, it's too crazy. So the minister from Russia, from the Soviet Union, he's in Beijing saying, hey, let's not let things get out of hand here. And Mao's going, no, let's go for Armageddon. Yeah,
Gromyko later wrote that Mao had said he could lose 300 million Chinese. That's nearly half the population at the time.
Wow.
The Soviet foreign minister, he makes it clear to Mao the Soviets are not going to get involved. There are not going to be any nukes.
Thank heavens for that. So back on Taiwan, American air and naval forces have arrived. There's military aid coming in for the nationalists. We're talking weapons like artillery guns, and Americans begin supplying the island.
Yeah, so that's the tripwire. That's the potential spark.
American naval escorts are accompanying Republic of China convoys to a couple of miles just off Jinmen. And of course, the Chinese consider the escorts a violation of their territorial waters, and the Soviets are likewise not happy with it.
Yeah, Mao is telling his puzzled commanders. You can hit the nationalist ships, but don't hit the American ships with them.
Those are not easy orders to follow.
Yeah. So thankfully, there are no major incidents. And Mao starts to wind things down in October, reduces the amount of shelling. He hasn't achieved victory, so he doesn't want to back down and stop shelling completely. So some shelling will continue for a while.
Yeah, a while means quite a very long while. October 25th, the Chinese declare that they will not fire on even numbered days. This is one of the most insane things that I learned when I was just like 11, 12 years old or something, that this went on for a long time. They made a deal for which days they would shell.
Yeah, so alternate days, yeah.
This allows Taiwan to resupply their military units on the islands, and then afterwards both sides continue to bombard each other with shells on alternate days of the week.
These aren't explosive shells. They're mostly containing propaganda leaflets. And from the ROC side, I think they had food for their starving cousins across the strait.
Right. Yeah. Eventually it turned into that. At the beginning, it was obviously normal shells. And because there was all of that shelling, I think you can buy a knife, a kitchen knife that's made out of the metal from one of those shells.
That's right.
It's one of their souvenir items. So this informal arrangement pretty much continues until the U.S. establishes diplomatic relations with the People's Republic of China in 1979. So we're talking more than 20 years. This back and forth shelling, it didn't really create all that much damage. They kind of targeted non-civilian areas for the most part. But of course, when you fire projectiles at places, accidents happen. And unfortunately, there were people hurt and killed from these bombardments.
Yes. But back to October 58, the world breathes a sigh of relief. The conflict could have gone nuclear. We know it didn't, but obviously at the time, people don't know that. During the conflict, the Soviet leader, Khrushchev, he warned the Americans that their involvement was threatening a world war, that the Soviets could be forced to honor commitments to protect communist China.
But he wasn't saying that behind closed doors.
No, quite far from it. Khrushchev was very angry about Mao's recklessness. He was angry that he hadn't been told in advance about the attack on Jinmen.
Yeah.
During his next meeting with Mao, it's in Beijing, 59. Wow, what a disaster that was. Anyway, the Soviets had promised to help China develop nuclear weapons a few years back, but in 59, they made excuses and, have to renege on our promises.
Yeah. We somehow feel that the guy who killed all the sparrows maybe shouldn't be holding atomic weapons. It's worth remembering that the utter madness of the Great Leap Forward is still at this point progressing at full speed. And these are just not the kind of leaders you want with nukes. So July 1960, the Soviet Union, without warning, informs Beijing it will withdraw all of its personnel from China. And by the end of August, all Soviet civilian and military specialists have left China.
At the end of the decade, the animosity would turn deadly. There was a border clash. Well, more than one. Border clashes brought the USSR and the PRC to the brink of war. The Russians had their nukes ready to go, and one of the targets would be China's fledgling nuclear arsenal.
Again, more of these what ifs. So China's nuclear program started with assistance from the Soviets in 1955, but in the end, it had to be completed by the Chinese. And we all know the history. They detonated their first atomic weapon in 1964. And then it took some time to work on, various delivery systems.
The nationalists on Taiwan are following these developments closely thanks to the Black Cat Squadron. That's ROC pilots flying American U-2 surveillance planes on very dangerous missions deep into China.
And Chiang Kai-shek decides to start Taiwan's own atomic weapons program. But this will have to be done in total secrecy because if America hears about it, they wouldn't be happy. And they get pretty close, don't they, John?
Very close indeed.
However, the story of the secret atomic program is a story for another episode. Thank you so much for listening. This has been another episode of Formosa Files. I'm Eryk Michael Smith.
I'm John Ross.
You can contact us at formosafiles@gmail.com. Catch you next time.
Bye.